Great. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the next CLEA seminar. Today we're joined online by Life Itself. Life Itself is an organization who have been mapping an emergent ecosystem of change makers. They've profiled over 200 organizations ranging from politics, well-being, arts, tech, and more. Many different names have been given to this emerging space of change makers, ranging from metamodernism, integral to the regenerative movement. In this talk, Life Itself Research Collective will present the concept of a second renaissance to set the stage for a constructive dialogue about what's going on in the world and what's needed for a radical transformation. So very much looking forward to the talk and finding out what it's all about. Usually we make a presentation for around an hour, and then there'll be space for a conversation afterwards. That format's a bit flexible, and it seems like there might be some breakout room action at some point. So great, over to you. We're really looking forward to the presentation.
So welcome, everyone. Thank you very much. That's great to see the room there. A real pleasure. Let me see then if this will... There we go. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, let me share my slides. And just for a moment before we begin, I would invite everyone to take maybe 30 seconds of just to get to breathe, to get to kind of come back to ourselves. I don't know what everyone's been dealing with all day, where you've arrived. It's a Friday afternoon, or if maybe it's early morning if you're joining online, but just to whatever you've brought, you can just put it down for a moment for this next hour, and you're here together. And just a real appreciation for your presence here. So just with 30 seconds of silence maybe, and just breathing before we begin. Great. Welcome, everyone. So in this presentation today, we're going to share some of our work. It's joint work of some of the research collective, not just of myself, Rufus, on a second renaissance, a time between worlds, or a moment of civilizational crisis and awakening. So just very briefly, if you're not familiar with Life Itself, we're a collective which is dedicated to bringing forth a radically wiser, weller world. And we do that through research, sense-making of this emerging paradigm, and from experimenting with it in residential programs around co-living. And there we are. Why is it? Oh, it's been a little bit odd that for 1 second there. So I'm gonna try. Let me just stop that. I don't know why it's not doing quite what I want there. So I'm going to zoom this way for the time being. So what I want to present today, and you're still seeing my screen, I hope, okay, and the slides, excellent. So what I want to offer today is a framework or a narrative that is there to kind of make sense of and of some of the things that are going on in the world at a large scale. And I want to emphasize, because this is an academic, somewhat academic seminar, if you like, that what I'm going to present isn't, I wouldn't say, wouldn't be like at this present time fully, academically rigorous. I think this is the kind of large scale kind of narrative envisioning. I still think it's grounded in kind of evidence and at least historical, I guess analogy. But I want to emphasize that it isn't like fully up to the kind of classical academic rigor, and that these kind of also big picture stories almost never kind of unfortunately are. So I want to start by talking to you about political polarization. And that's the example I want to look at today, and I want us to consider together. So I'd like, and I want you to start with is to think just for a second, I'd like people to think, what kind of political polarization, what examples of polarization or political tension are you seeing today? And do you think this has been on the rise? And I want to just hear from people at this point in the room. You can put your hand up on Zoom, or you can share in the room. Like, what examples, even recently in the news, would you see that were kind of connected to this example or this topic? And yeah, just please, you can put your hand up, or just put your hand up on Zoom, and we'll come to you.
I would say a prominent example is climate change.
Yes. And what's the kind of polarization you see around it?
The polarization would be a kind of dispute around individual corporate responsibility, the effects of climate change, and how that's, how much individual agency and blame. And that kind of manifests in various political parties appealing to different sensibilities of different groups.
So what would be, just to give it, so what is the polar, like on one side, kind of, just to kind of, it won't be a full summary, but on the one side you have what, and on the other side, or maybe there are multiple poles in the polarization, but what, just to make it concrete, what is on one side of that polarization? What kind of political narrative or social narrative is there, and what's on the other pole?
I guess on one side would be, the kind of approach that we need to take immediate action, and we need to decarbonize the economy, and this needs to come through political intervention. And then the other side would be a more kind of laissez-faire approach, that it's up to corporations to take the initiative on this issue.
Great. Yeah, great. Sorry, I think there's a tiny lag, so I may have cut you off slightly at the end there. It was so there's these kind of like two things. Okay, great. That was perfect. Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to give an example of an area where they see kind of polarization happening socially or politically at the present time? Either in the room or on Zoom. Yep, the war on, someone's mentioned, I think Stefan is saying, I can't use the mic now, that's fine. But someone mentioned the war in Gaza. So that seems like an example of maybe an intensely kind of polarizing type topic. What other things, like immigration or, oh, sorry. Okay, Alexandre, please. Yeah, please share.
Yeah, I just wanted to say maybe the personalization of content and media. So everybody's getting individual personalized content and information, and that creates different poles.
But what are the different poles then that come into existence?
I think there's multiple different poles, but yeah, we could talk about the different types of poles for a long time.
Right. Okay. Well, let's come to then promote the next point in it, which is that I want to suggest something here to us, which is that polarization is itself a symptom and not the disease itself. So if you imagine here that we're, if you, for example, had a headache and you're having lots of headaches, you're seeing lots of polarization happening, you can take a paracetamol. You can, and your headaches might go away for a bit. You might do some things. But if it keeps coming back, you know, maybe this headache isn't just, you know, your normal migraine. Maybe there's something actually more deep that's wrong. And the kind of point here is you need a proper diagnosis. You can't just keep popping the paracetamol. At some point, you want to go in and have like an MRI. You want to go in to the hospital and really look at what is the source of this illness. Now, I want to pause then at this moment, and I would like, you know, I don't know if it's in the room, people break, and then Matthew, here we have the breakout rooms, but I'd like to have the breakout rooms for a few minutes. And I would, let's say, I would like that to be, let's say, like, I would say 8 minutes, actually, I think on this one, it'd be kind of interesting. So if you can set up for 8 minutes, and what I want people to do is I want you first to kind of, if you want to say hello, you can briefly do that if you haven't met before. But what I want people to really think about in the breakout room and then in the room is picking this example that was discussed, or you could pick a new example of polarization. What do you think are the root causes? If you were like the doctor doing the diagnosis, what do you think is actually at the source of this, of polarization? And there might obviously be many factors, but I would kind of want you to kind of dig on the like kind of 5 whys basis, like why is that really happening, or what's the major factors that are behind this? And I want to check, is that okay, Matthew? Are the breakout room set up?
Not yet. I think I still need to be made co-host. So can we just double check on that real quick, Orion?
While we're doing that, what do people think, just if there's anyone again who wants to share either an example of political polarization or that what they think is like a real source of this? That would be interesting to hear.
I'm
Go
at
ahead,
co-host.
Michelle.
I think the basic reason for any polarization is human greed, a sense of insecurity born out of the will to power. I think that is the base on which all ills grow.
Great. And I think this is a great point. Like there might be these you know, that's a really deep root. One question I'd ask then is, but why do we think polarization has been increasing recently? Why does it seem, for example, I'm going to pick one concrete example, like in US society, but you can certainly look, I'm looking here maybe more at Western societies, but you can look at others. But let's say you look at the US, there seems to be evidence or data that polarization has been increasing compared to maybe 50 years ago or 40 years ago. Obviously, maybe it's less than it was before the American Civil War, but at least in recent periods, it seems to have been going up. And that seems to also be the case in many countries in Western Europe and maybe in other countries around the world. So I just kind of wonder, that's exactly true, but like, has human greed increased or reduced in some systematic way? That would be, you know, to kind of come to the point. So that's a really great point. I think that's like a source one, a really deep, you know, this question of greed. But what is maybe the other reasons that are more like kind of proximate that would lead to that? I'm just going to check, Matthew, do you now have breakout room capability?
It's not setting up yet. Just give me 1 sec.
Okay, great. And what other, I see people writing in the chat, and so Stefan, you can't talk yet. Okay, great. So the dissolution of local community ecosystems and replacement by identity-based networks. That's a good one. Anyone else who'd like to share in the room of like what they think are the source of the headache or online?
Well, I think that we also philosophically we live in a world of postmodernism, and each one has an own worldview and the right to have one. But in a sense, it limits also humanity. My opinion is as valuable as your opinion, even if you are an expert. But, you know, I have my own opinion. It might be connected with a source of truth, or it might not, like in the US, for instance, in many cases. And so I see many advantages of the philosophy of worldviews, but on the other hand, it has disadvantages too. That's what I wanted to say.
Very good. Okay, so postmodernism. And okay, and I see in the room there's someone who wants to share. Great.
Yeah, my own pet one contributing cause is complexity, kind of like, and due to the increasing perceived and real complexity of the world, we're kind of forced into a situation where we have to simplify things, and that brings out the polarization.
So there's a greater complexity. Okay, great.
Yeah, and another idea is that we have so much information available that it's much easier to follow a confirmation bias, to hang around bubbles that confirm our beliefs instead of trying to challenge them. So we end up being polarized.
Great. Okay, so there's like the kind of multiple, there's so much information, and we can then be in our own bubbles, and we can select the information that's consistent with us. Okay, Matthew, I think we'll take less time this now in the room, but is it set up? Can we adjust it to 5 minutes or something like that?
Would it be possible for you to set it up, Orion? Because for some reason it's not working on my end. Sorry about that.
Maybe we skip it for now. That's okay.
Okay.
If we're not able to set it up, we'll just keep going. I don't know. If Orion, can you, I mean, just to check, while I'm continuing, you could set it up. Is there a way to set up the breakout rooms for people? If you are able to do them, that's great. Okay. So meanwhile, if we come back, so I'm going to suggest to you.
Wait, sorry. How many rooms would you like?
I would like 2 or 3 people in each room.
So you want 3 breakout rooms. Okay.
Yes. I don't know how many people there are currently. 9. So, well, there would be, I would say, yeah, 3 breakout rooms without me and the room in it, because I won't go in a breakout room. Great. So what I want to suggest you could discuss in the room as well is that the root cause that, and I would like you to kind of reflect on, is that the polarization we're witnessing is not the illness, but it's a symptom of the illness of our society. And that in particular, what we would suggest, and it's the narrative we're calling the second Renaissance, that the polarization we're experiencing is actually at root a symptom of the breakdown of the cultural paradigm that has existed and that we've been swimming in for a long time, which is modernity. Or if you like, the conflict between cultural paradigms. Now, are we good to set up the breakout rooms now? Yes, or are we still checking? If it doesn't work, just don't worry. Let's leave it, and we can continue the way we're running. It's quite okay. I should have flagged it in advance. I just assumed it was straightforward.
I think let's skip it because it's just taking too long.
It's too complicated. Okay, very good. So that now, if you want to think about it, modernity, I want to talk here a little bit about modernity. So if we think about it, it's like the water that we swim in. We don't even notice it. It's because it's not what we think. It's because it's what we think is normal. And the best way to know what you feel is normal is to go someplace else that has a very different set of norms. For example, you know, you and I obviously think that slavery is no longer acceptable, that there is freedom of speech and freedom of practicing our religion. And I think people may know the story of the fish. There's 2 fish, young fish, are swimming along one day, and they bump into this older fish, and the older one says, "Hi guys, how's the water?" And they go, "Good, good." And they keep swimming along. And the young fish goes to the other fish at one point, turns around and suddenly says, "Hey, what is water?" What is water? And in this example, you know, water we are swimming in is modernity. And modernity has given us wonderful things. For example, it's given us individual freedom. Now, that was a breakthrough compared to what went before, for example, in the medieval age, obviously, when people didn't have it. But I want to now look at the shadow side of it. What happens when a paradigm sort of is decaying? So in this case, I want to ask people, what do you think is the shadow side of individual freedom? What is a kind of a problem that maybe starts to arise with individual freedom, which obviously has been really wonderful for a long time? Who would like to speak?
Well, I think the US is, and I live here for those who don't know, but it's really kind of a prime example of individual freedom kind of going off the rails a little bit. But I would say mostly it's kind of like you tend to disagree with a lot of people more, or there's kind of like a sense of like social anxiety. I think there's like that's really how I would describe a lot of one of the main like shadows of this freedom, that there's like a lot of social anxiety because you like between people, because there's so much disagreement.
Yeah, if I can add, social breakdown, disconnection, and lack of community.
Yes. Okay. And so that's one example. So that we have, you know, when you push individual freedom to its kind of extreme, that leads to loneliness. And then if you pick another example, which would be, you know, a great triumph of modernity, which is like technological and scientific progress. And thanks to that, we have modern medicine. But if you push that to its extreme, what do we get? If we take kind of the idea of progress to its kind of its logical extreme, what do we end up with?
Could you repeat the question again?
I was going to say, if you push the idea of progress, of scientific or technological progress to its logical kind of conclusion, what do we get that's maybe a shadow or a problem of that? I can't hear the room. I can see someone speak in the room, but I can't hear them. So it's...
I don't think there's any problem with pushing progress to the end. You get utopia, if it's real progress, but of course some people interpret progress differently.
But I'm being specific here of the idea of scientific and technological progress, of material progress.
Well, it's not the same thing. Scientific progress includes progress in society, in psychology.
Yes. But in the way that modernity conceives of science to some extent, or at least the way that the reductionist view of it, it would lead to a kind of a materialism. It would lead to, you know, it would lead to the sense of overexploitation, overconsumption, perhaps, or our technological powers exceeding our ability to manage them well. You know, you could see in that sense.
It's a particular reductionistic Newtonian view of science that leads to that.
Yes.
General. It's not technology in general.
Well, I would suggest maybe it's not just of any science. I agree about the point about science, but I would say the sense that our once we unleash, you know, like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, that famous metaphor, once our powers of technological advance were unleashed, and this idea of like we can have, you know, we can keep advancing, we can just make things better, particularly through technology, there's this incredible wisdom gap that opens up between our ability to manage those powers, like our capacities of wisdom or understanding, and the powers that we have. And that's a sort of recipe for at least for problems. And I would say that, you know, it's like you look at the climate crisis, it's not like, it wasn't like the case that 500 or 600 years ago, we were like so much wiser than we were today. It was simply that we didn't have the capacity to dig all of that coal out of the ground and burn it. We didn't have the capacity to build nuclear weapons. It wasn't like, oh no, if we'd had nuclear weapons in 1200, you know, the kings would not have used them. Well, there's actually more risk that they would have. But that gap in our capacity and that addiction or that desire for endless progress and technological advance leads us to a moment where we have this great risk, right? We actually are damaging the biosphere in major ways. Do you see what I'm saying?
We have done that before we had science. We were deforesting the whole planet long before we had science.
Yes, exactly. That's right. My point slightly here is that the idea, though, of progress of the technological capacity to damage the ecosystem at the scale it does comes out of this desire, which we did indeed overexploit ecosystems before modernity, for sure, right? It's not purely modernity, but there are aspects of modernity of the kind of endless growth that didn't exist in quite such a strong and powerful way and was not coupled with a scientific and technological enterprise to allow us to have like massive machine excavators to dig up mountains. That just didn't exist before modernity.
But also what didn't exist was the ways to combat those things.
Sure. I'm not sure modernity has those capacities. That would be my question, Lee. In the paradigm, the cultural paradigm of modernity, is there the capacity? You have to, in some ways, transcend modernity. For example, go from relatively linear reductionist thinking into complexity theory or to other things to be able to combat these things. They're part of science in the broad sense of what we would mean by science, the inquiry into how our world works. Absolutely. But think of the difference between Newton and chaos theory. They're massive, right? There's a fundamental difference in and also in humility, right? Once we have chaos theory, we have dynamical systems, we have complexity science, we have a much greater sense of how much we can actually understand about how the world works, at least right now.
Can I share something?
Yeah, I just want to make sure we keep, again, please, I just want to check the gentleman in the room doesn't have more to say, because that was a great dialogue that we were having there. So it was very constructive.
What I just want to say is that it depends how you define modernity. If you define modernity as the Newtonian mechanistic worldview, I completely agree with you. If you define modernity as science and technology, then I say science and technology is much more than the Newtonian paradigm.
Of course, science technology existed before it. I'm saying, though, the centrality of it. The centrality of it, the worldview. I mean, I would say, maybe if I were to put it more simply, I would say the domination of reason. And I want to emphasize, maybe I'm jumping ahead here. There's always there's very good things in modernity. I mean, modernity is an incredible achievement, just as pre-modernity or the medieval age had vast achievements. But I think the analogy I would use here is, think of the Catholic Church, to go back to the previous cultural paradigm shift in Western Europe. If you think of the Catholic Church, and in fact the Christian church in general, it's an incredible achievement at one point. Like, it is it's incredibly kind of egalitarian, it's expansive, at least in its sense. The church is this credible institutional structure. But by, let's say the 13th or 14th century, the church is becoming corrupt. The original kind of sacred ideals that lay at its core have become reduced to, oh, well, if you have the right rituals said, you'll go to heaven, or, there's purgatory and you can buy indulgences for money, all of this kind of corruption. Similarly, this incredible reason at its base is a beautiful, pure thing, right? Inquiry, true reason is wisdom. I mean, the Socratics and so on. But it becomes kind of debased, right, in our area. It becomes reductionist. It becomes reductionist rationality. It becomes the kind of, it becomes, as you say, maybe Newtonian, but also a sense in which everything that can be known is known through reason. There is now no longer any other space than that which can be known through reason, for example. This kind of materialism, a reductionism, a simplicity of it. Now, I'm not saying that is what all of science is, just as it would be simple to, it would be wrong to say, oh, what Christianity was the corrupt Catholic Church at the end of the high medieval age. Absolutely. That isn't. Like, at the core of Christianity is an incredible vision of the sacred, an incredible vision of love and the union of humanity and care and all of these things, and caritas. But I'm trying to get at is what does the reduced form, what do we see in the way that we relate to the world? Everything can be measured in GDP. This kind of mentality is, we all know it's kind of wrong, but it kind of comes to run our world in a certain way.
But if you come back to the example of the United States and Trumpism, is that the domination of reason? I would say it is the domination. I would say, sorry. I would say it is the domination of non-reason. So
But
how
that's,
do you
but
explain
we're
it?
going to come to that one. That's a great question. And I'm just not meaning to cut you off. We're about to come to that. But the question is, I am trying to say that in general, the dominant paradigm, if you look at least over the, let's say we went back 20 or 30 years, things are changing now and I'm about to come to the dominant structures or a kind of worldview of our world in the West. And you could see this if you go and look at Inglehart, or we actually go and look at, we should put up diagrams, we actually want to look at like surveys of people's values and what they think. They're secular rationalist, at least in the West. There's this dominance of secular rationalist thinking. And I'm arguing, also even reductionist in the debased form of it is a form of debasement that happens towards the end of a paradigm. So maybe I'm going to take one example because it's already great. We've really come on to this, and this is showing such a rich debate. So, so what's another example is take reason against religious dogmatism. That again was an incredible triumph of modernity, that I lived in a world where I could think freedom of conscience, that I could think for myself, that I could question religious dogma, that we could. This was amazing. But at some point, it becomes nihilism. At some point, the sacred has gone out of the world, or in Max Weber's famous phrase, the disenchantment of the world, like the magic has gone out of the universe. And we're left with, atoms banging into other atoms and etc. And we see this in famously, even starting in the late 19th century, in Durkheim's studies in sociology, was of suicide, the rise of suicide in France. And we still have that today, that there's a kind of growth, and you can document it in this rise of nihilism, in mental health, etc. So, and we have materialism as well. And I would like to suggest that we've experienced this kind of blossoming of modernity, and now we're entering a kind of decline phase where the shadows of modernity are becoming more visible. And what we're experiencing today is like seeing the shadows of modernity, and it's like a shift in the water. And you can imagine, for example, a Western modern person like you are, maybe myself, who grew up with these modernistic values. And if I took myself and I went to, say, suddenly, I don't know, Afghanistan or Iran, or even a seriously Christian fundamentalist sect or whatever, I would suddenly notice my values. If you were a woman and suddenly you're no longer, you take it for granted you can drive and you're allowed to do whatever you want, and suddenly no longer you're allowed to drive or can vote or have freedom of expression, you'd feel something is really wrong. Or if we took a seawater fish and suddenly I'm in like non-salt water, I'm in fresh water, that would be I even die, if I move my situation so dramatically. And so what I want to suggest, Matthew, just wanted to say something. I see that. I know the slides are no longer on. Yes, I see that at the moment. And so what I would like to put to you is that we were in a paradigmatic cultural paradigm shift on the order of the paradigmatic shift that happened in the last great one, which was from the medieval age through to the Enlightenment and the triumph of modernity, which started with the Renaissance. And now I want to also mention that we think of the Renaissance as a very tumultuous, it was in fact a very tumultuous time. We might think of the Renaissance and we think of Da Vinci, or we think of Michelangelo, and we think of these beautiful paintings. But politically, it was a moment of great turmoil and tension and excitement. There was the rise, even, by the way, and this comes to Trump, at the very time that we see the Renaissance and the growth of modernity, we also see the growth of the Inquisition and reaction. So something that's really you want to think is that at any moment that you have major transition, you also have strong reaction going back, just as you also have strong people pulling forward. So the other side of it, so you see that. And so instead of being in the decline of the medieval age, today we're in the decline of modernity. And that's where you have this kind of vacuum that arises, and you have these two extremes that tend to happen. One extreme wants to go back to the past. So during the first Renaissance, there was an extreme that wanted to go back to the Inquisition, for example, or the Counter-Reformation was an example of that. And on the other extreme, you want some kind of breakthrough to a new future, but often a kind of violent, potentially, breakthrough. And you think of the Protestants who went to churches and engaged in iconoclasm. I don't know if people know these examples where, you know, people go and like rip down the statues, they would rip down the paintings, they would burn them in this moment of iconoclasm in trying to kind of get rid of the old and break through to the new. And similarly today, we're in this vacuum of modernity. And we have some people who want to go back to some kind of more fundamentalist values, like we've seen in the US, where we see kind of, for example, the arguments over the reversing the legalization of abortion. And similarly, we have a tendency to react against modernity and wanting to kind of bring it forth to kind of, you know, throw down, you know, hierarchy. We want to kind of go into climate degrowth, to kind of reverse modernity and the evils of modernity. And you have at the same time this kind of transition and these extremities that happen. So I don't know if I can share my screen. I will seek to share my screen again here. Like, I think this is is this working here?
Yes.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, for example, this is actually 1524. This is just, you know, 7 years after Martin Luther in Zurich. I think this is like them burning a lot of the icons. And then to kind of just to reflect on where we're at the moment, you know, we want to look like we're kind of here, right? That this is roughly, and you could debate where we are on this diagram, but you've got pre-modern, which is still, and this, by the way, varies by country. So we could go and pick, like, if we picked China or we picked Russia or we picked the US, they're even at different places, right? I will come to that point. But let's, for the moment, focus on the US, just because most people, at least in this room, are familiar with US and maybe even know something about US politics because it's so, you know, if I talk about Dutch politics, people are going to be less knowledgeable. And right now you have, you know, you still have a significant portion of the US population that are at least are subscribed to pre-modern values, right? It's not a majority by any means. And the US was formed on modern values, right? The Declaration of Independence is clearly modern values, but there's a significant portion, and particularly as that declines, you know, even through most of this, I mean, can anyone name a US president who was not, who was an atheist or even agnostic, declared agnostic? There's not been a single elected US president, as far as I know, who was not actually paid up church going, you know, even in the US, for that matter. Obviously in Western Europe, that's the case, but in the US, you have a particularly strong pre-modern section. You have modernity starting to decline, actually, and there's even a modern reaction now. You know, Trump appeals to both pre-modern and actually modern, for that matter. And then you have the postmodern, the rise of postmodern segment that's now maybe dominant in the younger population. And even what I'm going to come to, maybe the next paradigm. And this is these moments when you have these breakdowns are periods of great, unfortunately, cultural conflict and tension and polarization. As you could see at the rise of Protestantism. You think of the last, Protestantism represents modernity crudely, and then they're both within Christianity, and Catholicism roughly represents pre-modernity. You can think of the polarization that happened in Europe, you know, religious wars fought for decades, even centuries in some cases. I'm right now based in Southwest France, right, while I'm giving this talk today. And this is an area where actually the farmstead, I'm living in a small farmhouse courtyard, and there is what was a chapel. It was turned into a pigeonnier, but it was clearly a chapel. And as you know, people who know their French history, there was originally there was first wars, then there was toleration of Protestants, and then there was the revocation of the Edict of Nantes under Louis XIV, and all Protestants had to leave France. So you have these incredible tension and conflict that arises. So I want to pause there and just check in for people. Like, what do people have clear in their mind? Also, what, if I were talking about these kind of paradigms here, I don't know if you can see my screen, but if we were looking just at these, like, what does this look like? You know, what happens, for example, when you have these paradigms, like very deep levels of thinking of value systems, for example. I don't know if is my screen readable for people. I hope it is.
Yes, the Zoom.
But, you know, for example, and I don't know if I have a good, if I bring up, if I'm in here just for a second and I bring up, if I bring up the paper, you know, just to think of the kind of the depth of even of seeing, and this is these points come from Gebser, just to kind of give credit where credit is due here. I mean, it'll take a moment to load. Even in the very way of seeing, the very perspective, which also shows up in the nature of truth. You know, we go for pre-modern where there's really no perspective. There's this divine truth. There's what, you know, there's perspective. There's ways of being more or less correct in this view, and then we come to modern perspective, just in the very ways we draw. So, you know, this is pre-modern medieval art. There's no perspective really. Then we have perspective through the Renaissance into modernity. And then finally, in the birth of basically post-modernity, we have Picasso, we have multiple perspective. And similarly, you know, like if we go look at truth, you know, where's the source of truth? You know, you go revealed truth, you have reason and science, then you have multiple valid perspectives in post-modernity. And you can imagine how hard it is to have debates or have any kind of constructive discussion if you don't even agree on the basic source of epistemological, you know, your basic epistemological framework is different. How are you going to you don't even have a basis to agree on what knowledge is. So the kind of conflicts you're going to have at that moment are going to be really profound. And you can even see the edges of it in, like, you know, does authority come from the church or does it come from the Bible? You know, Protestantism versus Catholic. Even within a religious framework, the starting of this move is there's just no common ground anymore of a kind. What is the center of concern? And you have all of these kind of moves of, you know, hierarchy to individualism and freedom to inclusivity and cultural relativism. You know, what's important? You know, following authority in a pre-modern world, being right is the most important thing if you're a modernist. Feeling good and healing are important if you're a postmodernist. You know,
is there another?
So I'd like to and take questions. Yeah.
Is there a fourth column to the right?
There is. There is a fourth column to the right. I will come to that. Do you want to look at it now?
No, you're in your good time. It just, we couldn't see it, so I felt like it was.
It was hidden. No, it's intentionally somewhat hidden just for the moment, but we'll come to that because I think the fourth column is more conjectural at this point. But to take, for example, we're in the complex, you know, my understanding is like transdisciplinarity, complexity. We're very much in the moving beyond modernity into kind of that which transcends modernity, you know, complexity thinking, transdisciplinarity, you know, multiple perspectives, etc. We get into a very different kind of form of even science than we had in the previous one, previous paradigmatic era. So I would like to kind of maybe stop there for a moment and see if there's some questions or thoughts.
Yes, maybe I have a question about these broad categories. Do you use them mostly as cultural aspects or also as personal cognitive aspects and beliefs? So, and if they are different, then how might a pre-modern thinker live in the modern world or in the modern culture or postmodern culture, and how would these two interact? So, like the subjective cognitive worldview implied by these broad categories versus the general cultural zeitgeist.
Well, so, like, I mean, I'm obviously doing a lot of, so I want to emphasize a few things about this. And as I said, this is a couple of things to say, I think, right at the beginning. So let me share my screen. I mean, it's a really rich question. So great question. Let let me just outline. So first of all, what I like to call this the candy rock. I don't know if people ever went to the beach and you kind of buy this kind of hard candy which has different stuff, different colors inside of it. So first of all, you want to think of that for any person, and we'll even come to any kind of society, but any person is some mixture of views and values, right? They're not it's not kind of as simple as I am setting out here in the, as simplistic, right? So for example, I want to talk about myself. I grew up basically I would crudely say with a father. My father was definitely in a modern worldview, I would call it, and my mother was more postmodern. And I've got some mix of views and values inside of me, right? For example, I can't stand it, this kind of like horizontalism. I can't stand it when there's like, oh, everyone's view is equally valid. I'm like, no, there's experts, there's expertise, etc. But I also find, my like in my father's world, it was all about meritocracy. It was all about, competing and winning and being, basically based on a set of rules. And so I'm just explaining that in any one of us, there is some mixture. And so, for example, and that people can even partition some of their world, for example, I don't know if people have heard of the Hutterites, but there is this kind of religious sect who live in, who's heard of the Hutterites here, by the way, just if you put your hand up. But the Hutterites are this extraordinary sect that they're probably the longest surviving communalistic group. They live with fully shared property, and they start in around 1530s in the Reformation. They're a Protestant sect, and they are like full on, like kind of fundamentalist. They have 13 children. They're pretty, or the other example you could think of is like ultra Orthodox Jews. Yet they are able to obviously use modern farm machinery on their farms. They're not like the Amish who don't even use modern machinery. So people are able to use, for example, modern technology while retaining maybe core views and values, in at least about maybe morality or other things in different dimensions. So first of all, I just want to explain there is this mixture, and that's obviously even more true in a society. So a given society is some mixture of people whose dominant worldview, they might have bits of other views stuck in, but whose dominant worldview is whatever. And you could look, this is actually, it looks like it's quite a crude diagram, but this is actually quite, if you go and take Inglehart type stuff, if you go and take World Value Survey and you go and look at the Inglehart type diagram, you get something, a distribution like this of like progress to modernity, if you like. But so to answer your question, which is like, what happens if I'm running on how do they coexist in a society, or what does it mean at the level of individual subjective experience? Is that what you're asking? Like, what is it like to be a pre-modern in a modern society?
Yes.
Well, in general, it's extremely painful, which is why what you see in most societies is that people, first of all, they homophilia, right? With the first law of sociology, birds of a feather flock together. So first of all, people tend to go live in enclaves with other people of a similar cultural paradigm. So classic, even, country versus city, this country's more conservative, Midwest America all votes for the Republicans, and, California and San Francisco all vote for Democrats or something like that. So first of all, there's this kind of sorting, but what goes on is at some point when they feel endangered enough, they engage in radical action. So for example, in the US, I would say, and I'm simplifying again political history, but in the late 60s, early 70s, the pre-modern chunk of the US, or that heavily influenced by pre-modern values, at least in their morality, felt themselves under actual serious threat. They felt it was combined with other, issues, but you basically had the entrance, for example, of the religious right into politics in a systematic way in the 1970s. They were called the Dominionists. They were a segment of the US evangelicals who decided that their values were under enough threat by the government, they felt, that they were going to get involved in politics. And you see this incredible takeover of the Republican Party in the United States from the 1970s onwards. The election of Reagan is this great moment where basically traditional Republicans in the US are sidelined, you know, Abraham Lincoln type Republicans, or just, you know, Nelson Rockefeller type Republicans. And you basically have people who are culturally conservative, even if they're financially basically pro big business. And that is what happens, is that, and you see this happening in other places right now, where basically parts of modernity feel under threat by post-modernity, I'd suggest. So the immigration debate is a great moment of tension between modernity and post-modernity, and even pre-modernity, right? Pre-moderns are really concerned about immigration because it threatens the cultural coherence of their society. Moderns are kind of a bit ambivalent, you know, like it's not really clear they'd be pro, you know, they're pro equality, but they're not really pro mass immigration. But like postmoderns would be a much more inclusive, right? They're much more wanting to incorporate people. And so you now at the moment in the US, you have a lot of populist parties who are basically going to get themselves elected by combining vote from pre-modern and concerned modernists to support them. And so you have a rise of populist parties who are kind of basically, they're called nationalists, but essentially they're riding this concern in this, and this deep tension over what is our culture, who controls our culture, you know. I mean, it's kind of obviously ironic in some cases, because some of the moderns are basically really worried about pre-modern you know, so at least some of their rhetoric is like they're really worried about immigration from, I don't know, you know, Islamic countries or something like that. Some of them, you know, and the kind of almost racist rhetoric you hear, but there's a kind of deep cultural Samuel Huntington Clash of Civilizations type story going on there. Yeah.
But I'm just trying to understand what you're saying. So you're saying that there's different points of view in the world that come from different kind of perspectives, different worldviews, and that it's difficult to always find a kind of coherent meta narrative that goes between worldviews that are essentially different.
Well, it's more, yeah. So there's always different. We got to be just strict about the term worldview here. Then it's like what like Germans are different from French, right? And are different from Belgians, and are different from English people, right? So there's always like there's different levels of culture, but there's what I would call the paradigmatic level. So there's kind of deeper structures.
Wasn't really like until the introduction of trains, right? Like it was only with the introduction of mass transportation. I mean, there was other problems before that, but it became a problem when more of a problem when those people started interacting more. And now we have more interaction because of the internet. So it's not really that the differences are new. It's just that we notice these differences more because we're more interconnected. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that. Although I would say that's a contributing factor, because people mix more. But no. I would say there's different parts, right? Like you're quite correct that for modernity, for example, to spread, you need that things like these cultural paradigms also are how do I put, they're even embodied in the forms and structures of a society, right? Like the laws, but even the technology reflects that. I mean, it's a complicated dance, right? Technology influences institution, influences culture, and vice versa, right? The plow. But to stay with it right now, no, I'm saying that there are moments of basically, if you think of these waves, to go back here, you don't have waves dying. If we're over just a moment in my waves. If you're in waves, there's points for a long period where a particular paradigm is dominant for long periods. So, for example, you know, at least in Western Europe, you know, there's a long period where the church comes to kind of dominance, and you know, there's the medieval world. Of course, there's a lot of variety in the late medieval world, but that it's nothing compared to what then happens between 1400 and 1800, when you have an entirely new kind of paradigm, an entirely new way of seeing the world comes into being and comes to dominance in the world. So yes, technology allows people to mix, but it's not the fundamental cause of cultural conflict, which is, it is actually that there are these major tectonic shifts happening. Or to take it, let me take another example right now. So in polarization, there's some people who say, oh, it's because of social media. It's basically this kind of like echo chamber type issue, which is, it's clearly truth to it, right? Social media algorithms have allowed people basically to go into filter bubbles, and it also maybe amplifies those filter bubbles by the kind of stuff that it promotes on social media. But is that actually the source? No, the source is there's like deep cultural conflict. Just like the printing press helped and maybe enabled in some ways or supported the Catholic Protestant tension, but it wasn't the source of it. Question, I can see someone in the room. Is there someone who wanted to say something? I was seeing the mic.
Maybe just to when I look again at your figure, I would like to hope that we are actually much more to the right, and I would say that I would hope at least that we are on the decline of postmodernism, and I think that's at least that's what some intellectual elites are starting to see, that postmodernism is a dead end. So yeah, so I wonder why you put us so backwards.
Well, exactly. I normally do this diagram where I let people put the arrow on, and I think it really varies by society. So like if you're trying to say globally and where is the leading edge, exactly. I mean, I would like to come in this talk in a moment, and I've run it partly by interweaving the discussion that we're a bit longer. And I'm experimenting with how best to do this talk, by the way, in that works. Do I just present everything and have discussion or this interaction? It really depends. I would like to think that. I think that maybe we live in an accelerated age and that postmodernism is declining. I mean, it's kind of clear that, in some countries, modernity is only just broken through. I mean, like, take China. I mean, China really only adopted, I would say, most kind of modern like structures in like around 1949, like between like 1910 and 1960. I mean, if you go to kind of cultural evolutionary work, the much more academic stuff of Joseph Henrich, at Harvard, and like key aspects of modernity is like breaking down kinship structures and moving to this bizarre evolutionary offshoot that is cause modernity, which is kind of getting rid of kinship models and so on. China only did that in 1949. China only banned basically concubinage in 1949. Culturally, while China has adopted a lot of the technology, much like the Hutterites have done, the degree to which you'd say China is, like China only had mass literacy the 60s, basically aftermath, it's the tough language, of course, but the degree to which it's operating on even a modern cultural paradigm would be an interesting question at a mass level. It hasn't broken through to democracy yet, if you like, which kind of most of the time you need for modernity or something that starts to look like that. Maybe you could jump straight to postmodernism. So that's one example, and this also leads to a question in the chat from Stefan. I just want to comment on, which is that this is clearly like somewhat Eurocentric, the story I'm providing, but I would wonder that while people move at different paces, whether, and is this the case maybe just due to military power, that modernity has become a dominant paradigm now around the world, at least for elites, So take the example of China's elite is probably somewhat running on modernity, even if, the way they're running their society, there's, even Russia, another country you might debate, how much has it reached modernity, etc. But yeah, so I think I think there's questions on postmodernity. I think there's a really difficult question I would ask myself, and this is where I think interesting research could be done, like in just interesting survey data, interesting questions for complex systems modeling or other disciplinary research, which is to understand how does cultural evolution actually happen, particularly at the micro scale. Even within families or within communities, what does that actually look like? What did it look like in the early Reformation? How did Protestantism actually spread? How do new ideas like this that are radically different in a way actually percolate and propagate? So to come back to postmodernism, are we just seeing like the iconoclastic early postmodernism, you know, hardcore wokeism, you know, and like, hey, you know, and we're not going to listen to anyone, you know, everyone's equal and so on. Is that just like early Protestantism that was pretty radical, that went and like tore down things in churches, and that we've actually got decades ahead of maturity of postmodernism? Or are we actually able to go into this kind of next paradigm, you know, which we could call teal or meta modern? This is a big question that I don't know fully the answer is, and that we debate it. We're kind of researching and discussing a lot within Life Itself research. You know, for example, going beyond postmodernism from like no, you know, multiple valid perspectives to something what I would call transrational. You know, there is an up. I think there's a good example in here, if I can find the quote. This paper, by the way, you know, this is I would say an example of kind of like meta modern or you know, beyond postmodern thinking that's kind of integrating reason with that which transcends it. So the statement that there is no such thing as truth is itself a truth statement and implies that it's truer than its opposite. The statement that truth exists. If we had no concept of truth, we could not state anything at all, and it would even be pointless to act. There would be no purpose, for example, in seeking the advice of doctors, since there would be no point in having their opinion and no basis for their view that one treatment was better than another. None of us actually lives as though there were no truth. Our problem is more with the notion of a single unchanging truth. So do you see that subtlety there? Like, there is truth. I like to say it like that. I don't know the top of the mountain, but I know which way is up. So I no longer have the single unchanging truth. I no longer know the top of the mountain, but I do know what direction up is, which is different from being in the no man's land of like, everyone's perspective is valid. You know, this point of view is valid, and this point of view is valid. But it's also not back in the world of like, I know the truth. I have it. It's unchanging and it's single.
Yeah, that's nice.
I see various questions in the chat. I don't know, Matthew, if you want to be in charge of bringing them up, because I'm not always seeing them come up. But yeah, and you know,
There's one question here which I found kind of interesting, which is more of like a speculative question. But can modernity or postmodernity be bypassed, or is it a necessary historical progression or step?
Yeah, and so this comes to this question. I mean, roughly what we're presenting is some kind of model, the spiral model. So again, this is a model that comes, you know, I call this grand unified theories of histories. I call this kind of work Guths, and they haven't always done very well. I have a lot of time for them, and I think they have a deep root in the kind of work of people like Brodel. Obviously, there are people, you know, Spengler, the decline of the West. You know, there are these big things, and in modern academia, they've kind of got a bad rap in my view, a bit unjustly. Like, postmodernity doesn't like big unified theories of history, and postmodernity has basically dominated at least a lot of the humanities for quite a while. But so this kind of spiral model of grand unified theories of history, that there are these large cultural paradigmatic shifts, and they kind of go in this spiral, if you like, and they incorporate also previous parts, just to emphasize, you know, when you get to postmodernity, you're still incorporating parts of modernity or even pre-modern, you know, and the best world is one where we integrate the best parts of these going forward. But the answer is, can you jump from like this to postmodernity? I mean, individually, I think it's kind of possible. But I think I mean, it's an open question. My view is that we do have to go through through these phases. So I think it's kind of like saying, you know, and this is a big question, and this is a bit like the analogy that gets brought up here with developmental psychology. So can children jump phases? Can you go from, you know, concrete operations to, you know, post-formal operations in Piaget's developmental psychology? There are these kind of questions, and my guess is that these are a bit like cultural stages that we have to pass through as societies, and that they're difficult to jump, but perhaps, and the jury's out on that kind of question. And again, this is the kind of thing that's a bit, I don't know, and I'm not now. I used to be an academic at Cambridge. I was an economist for a while. What you'd really want here that would be absolutely fascinating, and I don't know of its existence, is, except in very small samples, is longitudinal data on individuals. It would be the equivalent of the World Value Survey, but where you could get disaggregated data labeled at the level of an individual person and track them over time. Because what you'd be interested in is, are there sudden kind of shifts in views and values? Why does that happen? And so on. And I just don't know of such data sets. I mean, nowadays you might start to be getting some of them out of the kind of work people do with Facebook data. But again, it's very difficult to obviously get individually identify, or at least be able to identify, even if they're anonymized, the same person over time. But that, you have it anecdotally in books. So you could go and look at people's autobiographies. You could go and look at people who have sudden shift in views and values and how that happened. And classic examples also is people who kind of are maybe in an evangelical, a fundamentalist Christian household, and they shift. They leave at some point and they transform into a different set of values. 2 hands up.
Yeah, so just a kind of point of order kind of thing. So it's 4:15 now. We've been talking for about an hour. Is it maybe time to move into some questions? Maybe hear some like different voices in the room. Is that maybe it's also at some point nice to hear a little bit about also your organization and how it relates to these questions? Well, that'd be my first question actually.
Well, I'd love to have some discussion happen in the room or around. I think that's a great point, which is at this point, while we've always had a lot of discussion in it, I think that would be great to do. And I could say, do you want me to take that first point, the last point first, or I'm happy to come to that a bit later?
So can I think what we are missing here a little bit is we here in our center are already thinking for years, if not decades, about this meta-modern, postmodern worldview. So it would be good if you could summarize your view of that aspect, because that is where we probably will have most agreements and potentially disagreements, but then we will know what to disagree with, because I think that all the other things you have been telling us, basically we agree with. We know that there are these different periods. We know that you need to go beyond modernity and beyond postmodernity. And now we would like to hear what your view is of this postmodernity. So if you could summarize that, that would be a good basis for the discussion.
Excellent. Shall I do that quickly? I will try to do that briefly. So so first, here's a really simple kind of 1-slide summary on the secondrenaissance.net. So just emphasizing, maybe you can drop it in the chat. There is this website, it's now live and shareable, where there's also a link to a white paper at the bottom of the page, and I'll put on there that you can get a more detailed write-up. But so things like fundamentally that we would suggest is, one is at a kind of societal level, there'd be a reorientation from outer growth, which would still be valued, but there would be a movement towards cultivating inner growth, including though in a scientifically rigorous way. So I don't know if you can see my screen, but the inner growth would be prioritized over material growth, with a recognition of our potential to consciously evolve personally and collectively in multiple dimensions, to wake up, grow up, clean up, and show up. So that would be one major feature, is the kind of inner growth, a kind of emphasis on wisdom, a renewed cultivation of wisdom, and definition of what wisdom, or I don't want to say definition, but not like wisdom's some vague thing that sages have, but a real cultivation of that, based on a recognition of the limits and value of reason, and of the importance of the whole and the value of a long term that includes all of the living. Third would be the idea of kind of interconnectedness and interbeing. This really seeing how profoundly interdependent relationship we have to each other and the planet in a way that is regenerative, ecological, and connecting. And then I would say reintegration of the spiritual and the religious, in a not in the way that we maybe conceive of as dogmatic, but in a kind of going beyond secularity to reintegrate spirituality and religion into collective life. Secularity was obviously one of the great also pillars of modernity, and that at least you kept religion and spirituality, but it was a private matter. And then going beyond capitalism, a new economical system beyond capitalism, socialism, grounded in new ways to assess value. There's also quite a lot bit more in here. I mean, there's and then things on community, political engagement, and so on. Is that useful? Just, I know it's only 5 points. There's a lot of depth to some of those. I mean, but that, obviously there'd be things in science. I'm not quite sure what this science looks like. In my view, some of like what I would call systems thinking, complexity will definitely be there, but it's more like postmodern, the breakthrough of postmodernity in a way. But that we could debate whether that counts as beyond. It's clearly part of what comes beyond postmodernity, but it's, I think that was a great achievement of the postmodern phase, if there is a specific postmodern phase. That's it.
Okay, this is indeed very useful. I think that most of us here in the Centrally Apostle would agree with this vision. Now, the question is, what does it mean more concretely? And what we have been, especially, is the scientific foundations. That means that not just complexity, chaos, etc., but there are a number of what I would call relational ontologies or process philosophies that mathematically it and that can give a foundation for that. So that's also one of my reasons why I was in the beginning disagreeing with your equating modernity with science. There are scientific approaches that go well beyond the kind of simplistic modernity that you have sketched. The only question I would have here on that scheme is spirituality. Okay, religion depends what you mean by religion. If religion means having certain articles of faith or certain gods that you believe in, then I'm not convinced that we need that.
Yes. So, I mean, these are great points. And I think what you're saying, if I can just resonate with it, and I've read, to say, I've not been maybe echoing enough in this, but I've read, and obviously I've read quite a bit of the material about the center and some of the work, and it's incredible. I think this is why there's incredible resonance here, is that this, I hadn't actually come across the center until about 1.5 years ago, and Matthew kind of introduced it, and yeah, just really, you're completely right. And I think that kind of what the McGilchrist quote, or I would say in general, is that there is a science and a philosophy of this, and there is a rigor to it, like as you say there. So absolutely, I'm just agreeing that there is total resonance there. And I guess I would say on the religious point, this is a really delicate one that I traditionally didn't bring up so much. I think in some ways, I kind of feel that any truly profound kind of worldview, at root, a worldview ends up looking a bit like a religion, right? Like science when people say, oh, science has become a religion, we do know what they mean, which is that, it's given, their faith, and even if their purpose is like, you can feel like the idea of we've got to go to Mars, like the Elon Musk kind of vision, or we've got to kind of go to other planets. It's a very modern, almost like kind of religious vision, like this is the end of humanity, is to go to the stars. I don't know if anyone's read Octavia Butler's Earthseed series here. But literally there's a religion which is like the vision is to go to the stars. It's like that is the game of that religion. God is changed. This incredible, this beautiful book, brilliant book. And it's kind of, so what I'm trying to say is I think that there's some reintroduction. I think it's non-dogmatic. I think it's open-minded. But the idea of some kind of core shared ontology, some kind of core shared visions, I'm not saying for the whole of humanity over the whole earth, but I think that there will be something that must look like that. That's my increasing feeling, that there's something that's shared at quite a profound level that goes to epistemology, that goes to values, that goes to the way we see the world. And that ends up looking very like a religion of a kind. whether you like to call it a religion, I think it looks a lot like it. It's just we've got a huge allergy to religion, right? Like we don't. In general, I grew up as a rabid atheist. Like I've got a it's like I was made to sing. So I had to go to a school where I was made to like sing Christian songs every day, and I wasn't allowed to not sing them. And even in a very minor form, my experience is kind of oppression for myself, which religion has been of a form in the West, at least. In certain places, it's been a form of dogmatism. But yeah, so that's, but I want to pause. I want to allow more discussion in the room, and I'd like to maybe dialogue between people rather than with me.
Yes, if I may criticize at least the points that you have on this slide, to me they don't look meta-modern or post-modern. They could be very compatible with a pre-modern or a modified modern. So I think what's lacking is really the integration of science, of multiple perspectives, of multiple scales, and to also take into account the dynamics of hierarchies, of complex systems, and to have really a much more complicated and complex apprehension of the world, and not just inner growth or we are all connected or very simple memes like this.
Does anyone else want to say anything to that before I want to allow some dialogue in the room, and then that's a great point that I'd love to come to.
Reflection that this diagram that we're looking at now, to my understanding, it's a very modern diagram.
Mhm.
It's this notion of like linear progression and so on. So there's something to think about there.
Yeah, just building on that, I also feel there's kind of a teleological aspect to this, that it's heading in a particular kind of direction, and that I want what your thoughts are on that. But also I just kind of was wondering, in a very practical sense, how do you envision your how do you see your organization, and like what role does it play in kind of overcoming these very social, political, cultural paradigms?
I don't know if Matthew, you're noting any of these questions down in the chat. It'd be super helpful, just because otherwise I should note them down. But if you notice people say, then we can come back to them. I don't know if are there any other comments people would like to make or questions. Then we'll kind of take a bunch at once, or people could comment on each other's question. I see Simon, you've maybe got the microphone. You'd like to say something? Or
Thanks. I wasn't quite sure what to say at the moment, but yeah, I will say something actually, which hopefully will be useful, is that the wiki which we're starting off here is my vision for this. I think we've heard a lot of your worldview, Rufus, and I think what I'm missing is the live questions which we might actually come around. This is incredibly. This is not even under construction yet. It's pre-construction. So don't look at it now. But you're welcome to join in, by the way, all of you. And I think that's to me the I would love to see a bit more of a shift from answers to questions, from this is the way forward to, well, this is what we don't know at the moment, and this is what we're trying to find out. And actually, as part of that questioning, being also careful and reflective to think about what the assumptions are behind the questions which are asked, almost like deconstructing the questions as well, just to make sure that we're not actually channeling ourselves down a particular way by the questions we're asking. So that's I'm really keen on some really carefully crafted questions here, which actually bring out the actual live issues which we share and which we can actually engage in some really creative research on.
I'd like to add something. What is the reason for emergence of any idea? Is the entire world a postmodern today? Or some parts are medieval, some are modern, some are postmodern? Has the entire globe progressed in the fashion that you have shown? What constitutes human well being? And should such ideas revolve around that? Do we have a concept of global human well being in the first place? UN started the Human Rights Declaration, and I think that was first attempt at moralizing the idea of human well-being. So, what is human well-being? I'm not able to get around this. What constitutes human well-being, and why does such an evolution take place in the first place? And if there is a meta-modern which is coming now, what shape should it take? Is of course what we are discussing. But is it really? Can we surely say that there is a new wave coming, or maybe it's a mixture of all that is existing already?
And if you captured that, okay, Matthew. Great, just great questions. I mean, I think questions I have, including to the research center, to CLEA and to VUB, it's like, and I think the gentleman maybe who asked the questions unfortunately just has set off, but maybe to answer the last question, some of the others together, I think the inner growth point is actually huge and isn't simplistic. Like, it's not the same as feelings. Inner development or inner growth is not the same as just feeling good or whatever, you know, like it's like, and the revolution I feel here is, if you think that modernity, you know, I think the great, you know, if I would like to point to the greatest achievement of modernity, you know, the two would be like this freedom, this aspect of reason coming to run political society of a kind, you know, however imperfectly, and the material progress. But that began, you know, with science of the external world in a way, and the use of reason. But the inner world, we've only really had psychology 2 centuries, but properly, you know, a century and a bit. You know, we don't, you know, to come back to your question of how would we measure well-being, I think I had to pick one thing that would replace, you know, GDP, and we wouldn't have one in the future world, of course, all of this other stuff, but like, just to pick one, it'd be like some measure of the ultimate kind of inner development of our world, of our societies. You know, I think there'd be other factors, how we treat the planet and all kinds of things. And just to pick an example is, I don't think we've had an actual rigorous scientific measure of even skills development, what I'm going to call skills development, let alone the other dimensions like spiritual development and others, until basically the last decade, which is the Lectica measure. If people don't know Lectica, it's basically the culmination, I would say, of the neo-Piagetian tradition with, you know, through Piaget, Kohlberg, Fisher, and so on, to an actual rigorous data-driven method of assessing models of hierarchical complexity. Yeah. And that's only emerged in the last 10, they actually made that in the last 10 years based on research. Kurt Fischer, I mean, you know, it's like really, and isn't funded, by the way, that work very much at the moment anyway, like that whole stuff. So I just say that, you know, we have, you know, I'd say Jeffrey Martin's map of interdimensional stuff, but, you know, map of actual spiritual development. Or now I don't want to be careful of like higher is better. We want to come to that. I want to be careful, very careful about that. You can be a very highly evolved psychopath. It's really like real wisdom is a bunch of a combination of factors. But like, we don't know how we, you know, if we were saying like, how do we cultivate wisdom? How do we even measure? And I don't want to say measure, it might be like, the example I often have is like Christopher Alexander, for me, is the epitome. If people know Christopher Alexander, is this epitome of integrating science and something that transcends science in an area that actually matters, like the built environment. And what does that rigorously look like? How do you start having a cadre of people like, oh, they know how to sense wholeness in buildings? You know, it's not going to look like something that can be reduced to a tick box on a form or can be assessed in a simple way. The kind of things we want to assess, like assessing wisdom, is going to be really complex. You know, it's going to be complex, or assessing these ability to have these different kinds of ontologies. So that's what I think this world somewhat looks like, and why I would come back and say the inner development. I think the other part, this element of meta modern thinking or integral, I mean, really, I think for me, I first really got out of integral type thinking was that conscious evolution, and the fact that this is not the end. What's missing this diagram is this keeps going, obviously, just forever. We don't know the end of this spiral of cultural evolution. Seeing that for the first time is very the beginning of meta-modernity, in my view, like that, or what goes beyond post-modernity. Seeing the idea of cultural or ontological evolution is a key insight that doesn't exist in previous paradigm. Now, just to take another example of a research question, Simon, you know, it's clear that actual cultural evolution at the non-paradigmatic level, at the level of like Germany versus France, or even subcultures within those, is much more like a reticular tree. It looks like a phylogenetic tree, but with lots of reconnection. Well, is it actually correct that there's like linear sequence of spiral, even if they're in a spiral of cultural paradigms, or is it more complex than that? I don't know. I think that's an open. We don't even have very good data until very recently on cultural evolution. You know, proper cultural evolutionary theory is what, 30, 40 years old, if that, with empirics of cultural evolution. 1990s, they really begin. I mean, I might be wrong. There's obviously much older stuff, you know, that has ideas in anthropology for the last century, but kind of in terms of data-driven or rigorous or more scientifically grounded, I don't know. So I think there are these really big open questions about that. And then how does adoption happen, or how do we measure its progress or stuff? You know, I don't know. And this could all go wrong, right? You could have a massive descent. You could have massive collapse and breakdown, which is currently the trajectory that we're on, right? That is unfortunately, we don't, you know, maybe one day we break through, but we don't break through right now. I mean, just to say, I'll just post it in.
But if you look at, for instance, the question assessing wisdom, how to look at assessing wisdom? You could say, well, we have a scientific look. It's based on facts, a repeated experiment. But unfortunately, many items and topics like assessing wisdom cannot be treated only by science. It's too limited. So then you have philosophy, arguments, more or less logical arguments, pro, cons. Okay, we can come further. You also mentioned religion, and religion is based on faith, is based on belief. And do you think that in making progress to metamodernism, we have also to use belief? Intuition, if you want, maybe belief is not the exact word, besides science and philosophy.
Yes, I mean the best analogy I hear, because just to go back, I think wisdom, right now we govern our societies basically in modernity on rules and bureaucracy, right, and democracy overseeing that. Like if I had to give a crude model, it's right. And the example I'm going to give here is building houses, because I think this is a great toy example. So how do we regulate what can be built in modernity? Well, we have an ever more elaborate rule system with a bureaucracy that enforces it, a legal system that deals with things that get into dispute, and then some semi-democratic process for revising those rules and regulations. Now, that system, I think, clearly doesn't produce the world that we would like to see. It's better than maybe where we just allowed to do anything we want, you know, I don't know. But this is where you come to Christopher Alexander. Why I'm bringing this example is the best example of the analogy I can think of the role of wisdom in the future, and of like even in governing our societies, is in Christopher Alexander and his work, you know, in the pattern language and more important, the nature of order, where what he's trying to say is there is some kind of better, you know, it's why he's going beyond postmodernity, which dominates architecture, right? He's like, there is a better kind of house. There is a more whole and more beautiful kind of house. And even these are the values we should care about, like the living, the whole, these kind of things. And you want to think about, like, what would a meta-modern planning process look like? Well, it would need a whole bunch of people who understood wholeness, who could sense wholeness. And what's crucial in Alexander is he both uses reason, he has a lot of even mathematical type argument, but his what he talks about what is truly whole or beautiful or living, most importantly probably is the word living, goes beyond reason. So if you imagine this future like planning authority, you're going to have people who come around and say, no, you know, this architect is approved as, you know, they know what wholeness is. They know what the living is. They can sense it. But there are debates, right? There are discussions, but there is some kind of community of practice that's self-validating that can assess what buildings should be built or not, but which is not reducible to a set of rules.
Mm-hmm.
It may involve some rules or some patterns. Interesting, like Alexander called it a pattern language, which is very, I think, metamodern. Like it's neither like, oh, everything's whatever you feel like, nor is it rational rules, but I've got these patterns and I've got people who can sense this or can create it or can bring it forth. Similarly, imagine your future governance of society. You want people who somehow have these qualities of wisdom and who can develop them and can be assessed by others, can be held accountable, but they're no longer reducible and they're not going to be, it's not going to be democracy anymore. It's going to have aspects of democracy, but it's not going to, now democracy, as we know, has many limits, but to have a community of practice who you can trust, who don't abuse their power, which is classically the problem. How do you do that? This is a very rich discussion, and it goes very deeply. And this is where you get into the religious aspect. You know, think of Buddhism, you need insight. You know, in Buddhism, there are the three aspects, right? There's concentration, like your cultivation of the ability to basically meditate, if you like, and get into concentration. There's insight, and there's ethics, right? And crucially, ethics is essential along of those three that mutually support each other. And so what does it look like to actually cultivate wisdom in a rigorous way, in a way that, again, like Alexander, I love is you can partly define it and it partly transcends any definition. It's something that you can sense, like really cultivated people can sense it, but you can still talk about it with reason. I mean, McGilchrist has this in his books as well for me, this ability to both talk with reason and you're pointing to something that transcends reason that you can feel. And this is this word, I mean, I got it like valueception. How do we cultivate, how do you rigorously cultivate valueception, the ability to sense value?
Mm-hmm.
And which is not in modernity reduced to everyone's taste is equally valid, the democracy of the market where everyone can just buy whatever they want and they choose. No. That, I mean, that's why a load of people get reactive about Christopher Alexander, all this stuff, because they're like, but who are you to tell me what I'm allowed to build? You know, why should you know better than me what beauty is or wisdom, you know, wisdom is? But people do. The question is, how do you not have that abused? And how do you cultivate that? And how do you assess it? Assess it, like crucially, validate it, but not in a reductionist, you've done an exam way. The other metaphor I use a lot is judges. Judges are not scientists, but a good judge incorporates reason. They write judgments that are reasoned works, but their ability to sense the truth. And think of the wisdom of Solomon, this close connection of judgment and wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a whole nother chunk of this paper that we're writing on, the book we want to write. It's like, I think the role of wisdom and this metaphor of wisdom and its role in governance, that's the other, why it's in this diagram here, is inner growth is what you prioritize rather than GDP, crudely. And wisdom is the ability to govern. Like, ultimately, it's the meta feature. Like, just as like Alexander's sense of the living is what allows you to decide what to build, wisdom is the feature, which is basically, how do you govern a collective? So it's the crucial other feature of that world, right? You've gone from bureaucracy and reason, and in postmodernity, it's all like, I don't know, consensus or something, you know?
No, thank you for your answer.
I have a question if it's possible.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just curious as to what's your perspective on, and something that was not really addressed or not a lot in the talk, is the driving forces and the power in place today that are mainly the people who possess money in our world. How does this come into play? Because a lot of, and why I have this question is, I feel like in these points that you put up here, they're very personally centered. So the problem coming from inner, from the self, rather than having some, in place power who is causing that.
Yeah. Great question. So I'm going to come and answer that. I also wanted to answer, what does life itself do? People asked this question before. So one is, and there are lots of questions I brought up, just to say, like, if I were to frame it in the way Simon very rightfully suggested, that question can be better. I don't know what wisdom, how we assess wisdom. I don't know even, I don't want to say define wisdom, but how do you sense, how do we reason about it? How do we describe it? And these are lots of open questions that are there. I'm not saying, I think there are some directions that one could go in and I comment on, but I just want to say this question also that I think you're pointing to, which is, how does politically this get brought about? How does one, maybe, I don't want to say you're going to bring it about, but how does one nurture the seeds of the second Renaissance? How do we cultivate this emerging paradigm? How does transition happen? Can it be kind of midwifed or supported? It's not just we stand by and, the world will just unfold. How does that happen? To come back to life itself, one is there's this kind of, you need to bring people together, I think, who share this. And so one of the things we're doing is this Second Renaissance project at secondrenaissance.net and other work to try and, I guess, build awareness. I mean, the aim of this project is not that it's novel. I think many of the things we're saying that, really is just standing on the shoulders of other. We're not trying to, or asserting any real novelty here. This is a distillation, but trying to make it more accessible. We sense that there is this emerging ecosystem of, we've done a bunch of research on this over the last few years, but like of organizations, ideas, and so on that are happening. There's this kind of map of the core of this ecosystem here that's on this website. But just to say, so one is life itself. We do research and sense making and try and basically build a movement also for a second Renaissance, or build that. And the other is that we actually try and develop what I call pockets of the second Renaissance, which are these deliberately developmental spaces, physical spaces where we do conscious co-living. They can be online spaces, but our view is, just like Protestantism, the future gets pioneered in small pockets at the beginning that, come together. And so those are the two aspects of what life itself does. At the moment, I would just go is like, if this is our theory of change, is that you kind of want to create pockets of a second Renaissance, which is you want to support the formation, sustenance, growth of them, and you want to build a movement and involve in like cultural activism and research. So that's the two things that we engage in quite a bit. So the pocket start is what we call deliberately developmental spaces, where we try and start hubs or support other people start hubs or online communities, which are pretty dense with these aspects. And then the other one is the kind of cultural activism, the research, the movement building, to have a larger, a larger thing. Now, to come to like political change or social change, I think what happens is at the beginning, you form these pockets, and at some point, obviously you get there's significant resistance from the dominant paradigm, but you start to have some people, someone in the community makes a load of money, or there are more people who make resources or have other kind of resource, and they contribute those in some way. They support it. So, if you think of Protestantism at the beginning, it was Martin Luther nailing something to the door, and some people who started to really feel this was correct. And, the Catholic Church seemed all powerful in Europe. And yet Protestantism became very, very successful, and at least ultimately the kind of the meme virus that Protestantism was carrying, which is basically much more reason-based. You're going to think for yourself, you're going to read the Bible yourself, you're going to become literate, you're not going to have maybe a priest who tells you what to do. You might even become like the Quakers, and you just sit around in the circle and feel the word of God, feel the Holy Spirit descend. That starts happening. So that's my view, is that there is also, I don't think there's a teleology. I think we can go many directions. I don't think it's inevitable, but there is being the possibility of our evolution to greater complexity here, at least, which is, I think, what this is. And that, I think some people believe there's even a life force in the universe kind of going that direction, but there's like some deep thing calling us. There's a pattern to the universe. I don't think you have to believe that or not, but I think there's the possibility of that. And that ultimately the reason that these paradigms, Alexandra, I think, can maybe ultimately succeed is because they do offer a world of like dramatically greater flourishing and dramatically greater ability to address collective action problems. And we badly need that. I think it's time for us in a moment. I don't know if there are any more questions, but to be very generous, everyone, with if there are more comments or questions people want to share, but we might then wrap up in a moment.
I'd like to share something. I have 1 minute. What constitutes good thinking? We all are so attached to the idea of thinking, the philosophy of thought. But what should we think? Is society reflecting enough today? It is not. But one may say a left liberal reflects, surely, but he reflects liberally. And a right extremist also reflects, and he reflects extremely. So like you said, moderation as a value, as a virtue, I think it needs to be promoted. And anyone who's truly in moderation can truly think, because we can't have thinking that is risky for human flourishing. We need to have thinking that is based on moderation and gradually build up on our experience. Otherwise, we are so attached to our own ideas, our own philosophies, and there is a sense of ego, desire that attaches to it, that probably societies lose direction. Maybe I could be wrong.
If I can contribute a little last thought here is I really like what you said, Rufus, about life itself, trying to make this whole concept more accessible. Not so much that there's anything particularly novel, but the way in which you put it together is really significant. The attempt is very significant, I think, and I think that remains with me a really live question, and this is partly because of my own background in education, being a school teacher and a university lecturer. How do you make these things more accessible? And bearing in mind the adult development models which we're aware of, which, you can't just jump stages of development if you believe in stages of development, but you can't easily jump too far. But even then, how do you make it more accessible? What are the environments, and what are the kind of like, I'm totally in line with the deliberately developmental spaces idea. And how do you constitute those spaces in a way which will accelerate the individual development and the collective development towards these general goals, which I think we very largely agree on?
I would love to ask the audience to just I put some things in the chat. People can write it in the chat. I'll read them out to the room. I mean, first of all, I just want to also express a lot of gratitude to people on the call and to the Center Leo Apostel. and to Matthew for organizing this seminar. Just to explain, a great thing for me at the moment is we're trying to constantly learn how to present this material to audiences, you know, and I can tell you, because I present it quite a bit. I mean, one of the reasons we have a kind of a deck, but each time, you know, the audience is either more knowledgeable or less knowledgeable, or, you know, this or that. What do you use the example of climate change or polarization? So what I'd love to ask the audience a bit at the moment is, either from the room, from in the chat, if you can read it, I'd love any thoughts. It's like, for example, just even in framing of today, we play around with, do we have a very interactive session where we pause and have questions? And unfortunately, the breakout rooms didn't, my responsibility for asking about that more in advance. But, you know, do you have a more interactive session, or do you present the kind of key ideas and like the structure, like a more classic seminar, and then have comments and discussion? Like, I debated that before today's talk, and I was trying interactive model, but I would love comment on what people thought from the room. I would also love comments on like the polarization. Are there other topics like the climate crisis or some other example that would work or resonate better? That's something we play around a lot with, is what example to use as that. Should we move quicker to describe the new paradigm? I think I heard from one of the gentlemen in the room that we should have moved quicker to kind of like describe the new paradigm and get into the meat of that and the discussion of that, rather than this kind of like more maybe basic, you know, oh, there are cultural paradigms and so on. You know, I would also wonder what people generally took away from today as like the most valuable or insightful thing for them, or the thing that they were most. The other thing I'm happy to hear is what was the least, you know, what could we have skipped? What didn't work for them today? Because this really helps us hone this material as we iterate it to share it with other people, both who are as expert as you and people who maybe not as expert. So I would love that if anyone wants on the Zoom wants to just write in the chat, that would be economical on time, and I'll make it easier to track. But any other points like that, I'd love to hear from the room, comments on any of those points, like structure, content, etc.
Well, we are not a very typical audience, I would say. As I said, we have been thinking about these things theoretically for a very long time. So we were especially interested in getting to the meat. That's to say that you would present the new paradigm the way you see it. So for me, the discussions about polarizations, they were kind of more distracting than helping. But it can be, of course, that with other audiences, it would work differently. What we usually in our seminars do is we first present the idea so that people have something to talk about, and then we make it very interactive and have lots of discussion, because it's easier to discuss if you know what you either agree with or disagree with, rather than kind of make vague statements about polarization. What everybody knows that it's a problem, but everybody also knows that it's not a simple problem. So you can make lots of statements about it. It does not necessarily lead to the heart of the matter.
Thank you so much. That's really useful. That was my sense from today, was that model didn't work so well. So thank you for saying that. But obviously it's useful to hear everyone's opinion. But thank you. Yeah. Anyone else with the views on the format or content? It's very helpful.
I think you could. I think it was very far-reaching conversation. There's a lot of different points covered, and it's great, very interesting that you're trying to find these kind of synthesis, this coherence. I think at times, for me personally, I would benefit from a slightly more like considered, like paced of presentation. You talk very fast. You make a lot of divergences. You bring in a lot of diagrams that aren't necessarily the thing that you're talking about at that moment. I would benefit from saying less, but making it clearer. Because sometimes you say something, and by the time there's even time to kind of come back on a point, you've said 4 other things. And so it makes it very difficult to actually have a conversation backwards and forth. That's my feeling. It's very hard to quite pinpoint at any particular time the where you are at in the narrative that you're presenting, in order that we can therefore have a genuine kind of feedback going backwards and forwards.
Thanks, Alexandre. That's great feedback. And I want to acknowledge, thank you for that. Yeah, that's a really great point. Anyone else who wants to offer comments, that's
Very,
I kind of just
very-
reiterate, that's basically have a more structured presentation and focus and present that at the beginning and then have the discussion. Great.
just echoing that from teaching 101, like 15-minute TED talk, there's a reason why TED talks are only 16 minutes because, you know, and to hone the basic talk to that period of time is something which is also a commonplace in the teaching world as well. And I think it's really good to get that and then break open is a really good way.
As I said earlier, what I feel like was missing was your very practical strategies for implementing a lot of these ideas, because that's really what I'm curious about.
Great. I don't know if there's anyone on the Zoom who wants to say anything or offer any comments. I think we're almost at time, so I do want to check that, but I just want to make sure that there were good comments. That's great feedback. Just thank you, everyone. I think there's a spot on. I think very valid, and I think that, yeah, I possibly, yeah. I was also...
I think the part of assessing wisdom as a question or as a topic was very valuable. Validating, judging is not the same as scientifically proving. It was compact. Assessing wisdom, it was beautiful to hear and to listen to, and it makes me think. Yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much, Rufus, and thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you everyone for your energy and for taking the time to share your ideas with us today. And thanks. Look forward to continuing the conversation at some point in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Matthew,
you, guys.
maybe you can email around the paper link. I just put it in
Sure.
the second renaissance.net/paper now redirect.
Sure, I'll do that.
Thank you so much.
See you guys.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks.